The air was thick with tension, the kind that lingered before a storm. The setting sun bathed the streets in a dim amber glow, stretching long shadows across the pavement. A gentle evening breeze rustled the trees, but the peace of the moment was shattered in an instant. A motorcycle screeched to a stop outside a small cafe, its tires skidding against the asphalt. A burly man in a black leather jacket, his helmet reflecting the city lights, swung his leg over the bike and stomped onto the pavement. His name was Bryce, a man with a short temper and an even shorter fuse. But tonight, Bryce was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Inside the cafe, the air was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon pastries. A few customers sat in booths, enjoying quiet conversations. Near the entrance, an older man in a military vest sat with a German shepherd at his feet. The dog, a service animal, rested obediently, ears alert to his handler's every movement. This wasn't just any dog. His name was Rex, a highly trained former military canine who had once served on the battlefield, saving lives. Now he was more than just a pet. He was the old man's lifeline, his guardian in the everyday battles of life. Jack, the man with the weathered face and calloused hands, reached down, ruffling Rex's fur. "You ready to head home, buddy?" he murmured. Rex, ever vigilant, lifted his head, his deep brown eyes locking onto Jack's with a silent understanding. He didn't need words, just that look alone spoke volumes. As Jack stood steadying himself with Rex's support, they made their way toward the door. That's when everything changed. Bryce, impatient and irritable, had no time for obstacles. As Jack and Rex stepped out onto the sidewalk, they unknowingly crossed Bryce's path. The biker barely glanced at them, until Rex paused. For a mere second, the dog hesitated, his head tilting toward Bryce as if sensing something wrong. That tiny moment was enough to set Bryce off. "Move it, mutt," he growled. Jack, unfazed, tightened his grip on Rex's harness. "Easy there, buddy. We're moving." But Bryce wasn't one to wait. With an irritated grunt, he raised his boot and, before anyone could react, kicked Rex square in the side. A gasp rippled through the bystanders. The force of the kick sent Rex stumbling, a pained yelp escaping his throat. Jack staggered, caught off guard, his breath hitching as anger and shock flooded his face. The cafe went silent. For the first time in years, Jack's hands clenched, into fists, the old soldier in him surging forward. But before he could say a word, something happened, something that made the entire street hold its breath. Rex didn't just recover. He stood, and he stared. His eyes locked onto Bryce with an intensity that sent an unshakable chill down the biker's spine. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't move a muscle. He just watched. Bryce, unfazed or pretending to be, rolled his eyes. "What? You gonna bite me, mutt?" He scoffed and turned away, his boots scuffing the pavement as he stepped toward his bike. But then, Rex did something unexpected. He took a step forward, and another. His gaze never wavered, his movements slow, deliberate. The street was eerily quiet now. People watched with bated breath, sensing something primal, something raw in the air. Jack didn't call Rex back. He didn't need to, because at that moment, Bryce made his second mistake. He turned back, eyes narrowing. "What's your problem?" "Huh? You dumb dog think you—" Rex lunged, not in an attack, not yet. He moved so fast that Bryce stumbled backward, his heel catching on the curb. He barely managed to stay on his feet. His breath hitched. For the first time, he felt something sharp stab into his gut. Fear, not of the dog, of what the dog knew. A muscle in Rex's jaw twitched as he stood his ground, head held high, ears pinned forward. His breathing was steady. He was waiting. Jack exhaled, his voice low. "You shouldn't have done that." Bryce's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The watching crowd didn't move. The biker swallowed, his bravado slipping. But pride was a dangerous thing. With a sneer, he shook his head, brushing invisible dust off his jacket. "It's just a stupid dog," he muttered, and with that he swung his leg over his bike. Engine roaring to life, he revved the throttle, shooting Rex a final glare. "Next time, mutt, stay out of my way." The moment shattered. Bryce took off. Down the street, tires screeching against the pavement as he disappeared into the night. But Jack knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, rain pattered softly against the windows of Jack's small home. The dim glow of the bedside lamp flickered as he sat at the edge of his bed, running a hand through his graying hair. Rex lay at his feet, unmoving. Jack's fingers hovered over the service vest, tracing the name stitched onto the fabric. "You, all right, boy," he murmured. Rex didn't respond. His body was still. Too still. Jack's stomach twisted. He leaned down, gently touching Rex's side, the spot where Bryce had kicked him, a sharp intake of breath. Rex flinched. Jack's heart stopped. Then, a slow, painful realization dawned on him. The kick had done more than hurt. Something was wrong. Jack grabbed his phone. His hands trembled as he dialed the vet's number. "Doc," he said, voice tight. "I think something's—" A sudden sound cut him off, a low growl. Jack turned, his heart hammering in his chest. Rex was standing now, his head tilted toward the door, listening. Jack followed his gaze, and that's when he heard it, a soft scrape. Footstep. Outside. Jack's blood ran cold. Someone was out there. Jack rises slowly, his military instincts kicking in. He moves toward the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the rain. But Rex's body remains rigid. His ears twitch. And then, just for a second, Jack sees it, a figure, standing at the edge of the yard, watching. His breath catches. The shape vanishes into the night. Jack doesn't move. His grip tightens on the phone. Something tells him Bryce wasn't done, and this time neither was Rex. The night stretched on, thick with unease. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the weight in the air remained, pressing against Jack's chest like an old war injury that never quite healed. Rex hadn't moved from his spot near the door. His body was tense, muscles coiled, ready. His ears twitched at the slightest sound, but his eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes, remained fixed on the darkness outside. Jack took a slow breath, his pulse steadying. He had been in worse situations before, war zones, hostile territories. But something about this, about someone lurking outside his home, about the silent warning in Rex's posture, felt different. It felt personal. Jack reached for the gun tucked inside his bedside drawer, but as his fingers brushed the cold metal, a realization struck him. Rex the dog hadn't been the same since the kick. Jack had seen the way his movement stiffened, the hesitation in his normally confident strides. The pain in his ribs was one thing, but this newfound paranoia was something Jack had never seen in his partner before. "You're hurting, aren't you, buddy?" Jack murmured, kneeling beside him. He reached out, but the moment his fingers brushed against Rex's fur, the dog flinched. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Rex never flinched, not from bullets, not from explosions, not from anything. But now at Jack's touch, a sharp pang stabbed through Jack's chest. This wasn't just about a kick. This was deeper. Jack's throat tightened as he withdrew his hand, his fingers curling into a fist. The unshakable bond they had built, tested through fire, through war, through hell, felt as if it had been cracked, fractured by something he couldn't see, and Jack had no idea how to fix it. The first attempt to reconnect morning came slow and quiet, the grey sky casting a dull light over Jack's small home. Rex lay curled near the fireplace, his body still, his breathing even. Jack sipped his coffee, watching him. He had to do something, so he started simple. Reaching into the cabinet above the fridge, he pulled out an old, worn-out tennis ball. It had been Rex's favorite, once. Jack knelt down a few feet away. "Hey, buddy," he said, voice softer than usual. "Remember this?" He rolled the ball gently across the floor. It bumped against Rex's paw. The dog didn't move. Jack's stomach twisted. He tried again, rolling it a little faster. Nothing. His heart pounded. He had never seen Rex ignore his ball. Not once. Jack swallowed hard. "It's okay, one step at a time." Taking a deep breath, he shifted strategies. "All right, boy, let's go for a walk. That should help. Fresh air. Routine." Familiar territory. Jack grabbed Rex's leash, but the moment he clipped it onto his harness, Rex took a step back. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Jack saw it. Rex had hesitated. Jack's grip on the leash tightened. "Come on, boy, just like always." He stepped forward. Rex stayed still. Jack turned, meeting those brown eyes, and what he saw made his chest ache. Doubt. Jack exhaled slowly. "It's me, buddy," he whispered. Rex didn't move. Jack felt something sharp in his ribs. Their pain that had nothing to do with injury. This wasn't just hesitation, this was fear. Rex, the same dog who had charged through fire, taken down enemies twice his size, and saved Jack's life more times than he could count, was afraid. Not of Bryce, not of the world outside, but of something inside himself. Jack's throat tightened. This wasn't just about a single night. This was about everything, about what that one moment had done to Rex. Flashbacks of a bond that once was. Jack sat on the porch, staring at the overgrown field behind his house. His mind drifted back to before. To the first time he had met Rex, fresh out of training. A bundle of muscle and discipline, his fur still soft in places where puppyhood hadn't fully faded. To their first mission together, the way Rex had instinctively known when to move, when to wait, when to act. To that one night in the desert, when an ambush had gone south and Jack had been bleeding out in the sand. He could still feel it, the sting of dust in his wounds, the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision, and then warmth. The steady weight of Rex lying beside him, guarding. Him through the night, that was Rex, that was his Rex, not this. Shadow of a dog who flinched at his touch. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had to fix this. But how? A painful attempt at normalcy, Jack tried everything. Old commands, familiar routines, treats, games, the whistle that had once made Rex come running. Nothing worked. The worst part. Rex wanted to come back to him. Jack could see it. In the way his ears twitched at familiar words, in the way his body tensed like he wanted to move, but something inside held him back. It was like watching someone trapped behind glass, screaming, but unheard, and then Jack broke. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, his voice coming out rough. "Damn it, Rex," he whispered. "You're still in there, buddy. I know you are." Rex lifted his head, eyes locking onto Jack's. A flicker of something just for a second, and then it was gone. Jack clenched his jaw. His best friend was slipping away, and for the first time in years, Jack felt helpless. The moment of almost giving up it was late when Jack finally let exhaustion win. He sat in his chair, rubbing his temple, watching. "Rex," from across the room. "You're not the only one who's been broken before, you know," Jack murmured. "I know what it's like." His voice was quiet, filled with something raw, pain memories. "I know what it's like to want to run from everything." He sighed, staring at the ceiling. "But you didn't let me, not back then, so I'm not letting you now." Silence. Rex's tail twitched, just slightly. Jack almost smiled, almost. But then the wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and something snapped in Rex. His body tensed, his ears pinned back. Then, before Jack could move, Rex bolted, straight for the door. Jack's heart lurched. "Rex, no! Too late." The door flung open. The night swallowed him whole, and Jack was left standing in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Because for the first time in his life, Rex had run away. The door slammed against the wall as Jack lunged forward, but the night had already swallowed Rex whole. Jack's heart pounded as his boots pounded against the wet earth, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The cold wind whipped against his face, and the distant howl of coyotes sent a chill down his spine. But none of that mattered. Only one thing did. Finding Rex. Rex! Jack's voice cut through the darkness, desperate, raw. Silence. Then, just for a second, a rustling in the distance. Jack's pulse surged with hope as he sprinted toward the noise. His flashlight beam cut through the trees. illuminating wet leaves and broken branches. Then he saw them, paw prints, deep, erratic, leading straight toward the dense forest. Jack didn't hesitate. A trail. Gone. Cold, Jack followed the prints, pushing, past thick branches, ignoring the sting as they scraped against his arms. The rain had softened the earth, making it easier to track. But just as he reached a small clearing, the paw prints vanished. Jack skidded to a stop, his breath heavy. No, no, no. He turned in a slow circle, his flashlight scanning the ground. The rain was washing away any trace of Rex's path. His chest tightened. He had lost him. The thought clawed at his mind, sending panic through his veins. Jack squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to think. Rex was trained, a fighter. He wouldn't just run without a reason, unless he wasn't running from Jack, but from himself. Jack took a shaky breath, pulling out his phone. The reception was weak, but he managed to pull up the GPS tracker on Rex's collar. A red dot flickered on the screen. Northwest. Moving. Jack didn't waste a second. He ran, a desperate search. The terrain grew rougher. The mud threatened to pull at his boots. The wind howled through the trees like something alive, whispering fears Jack refused to acknowledge. And then, a sound. Low. Guttural. A growl. Jack froze. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the source. There, just beyond the trees, Rex. But he wasn't alone. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at Jack from the darkness. A coyote. No. Two. Jack's blood ran cold. Rex stood his ground, his fur bristling, teeth bared. But Jack could see the hesitation in his stance, the same hesitation that had haunted him since that night. Jack's heart pounded. He couldn't afford to lose him again. "Rex," he called out, his voice steady but firm. "Come here, boy." Rex's ears twitched, but he didn't move. The coyotes took a step forward, their bodies low, their muscles coiling like springs ready to snap. Jack knew he only had seconds, so he did the only thing he could. He dropped to his knees. A vulnerable position. One that said, "I trust you." "Rex," Jack whispered. "I know you're scared, but you're still my boy, and I'm still your person." Rex's body stiffened. The coyotes growled, inching closer. Jack swallowed hard, keeping his movements slow as he reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around something small, familiar, the old whistle. He had carried it for years, since the day Rex had been assigned to him. Jack took a breath and blew. A sharp, crisp sound cut through the night. For a second, everything was still, and then Rex moved, not away, not toward the coyotes, but toward Jack. The moment Rex shifted, the coyotes darted back, startled by the sudden movement. They hesitated for only a second before retreating into the darkness. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, but he didn't move. He let Rex come to him. The dog took slow, cautious steps, his body still tense, his head low. Jack didn't reach for him, didn't command him. He just waited, and then Rex did something Jack hadn't seen in weeks. He whined low, soft, a sound of recognition. Jack felt something in his chest crack wide open. "That's my boy," he whispered. And just like that, Rex closed the distance, his body pressed against Jack's, his head burrowing into Jack's shoulder, his weight, his warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Jack shut his eyes, letting relief flood through him. For the first time in weeks, he felt Rex again, not just as a dog, not just as a soldier, but as his best friend. The first real breakthrough. Jack didn't rush things. He didn't grab Rex's collar or force him back toward the house. Instead, he just sat there, running his fingers through Rex's fur, letting the moment settle. "You scared the hell out of me, buddy," he murmured. Rex let out a deep sigh, a sound Jack recognized all too well, a soldier's sigh, a sound of exhaustion, of carrying too much for too long. Jack nodded, understanding. "I get it." He ran a hand over his face. "I get it more than you know." Because he did. Jack had been there, The nightmares, the memories, the feeling that he was someone different after the war, that he could never go back to the man he was before. Maybe Rex had been trying to tell him that all along. Not through words, but through silence. Jack exhaled, then gently tugged on Rex's collar. "Come on, partner, let's go home." Rex hesitated, but only for a second. Then he moved, right beside Jack, just like he always had. Small victories, but more challenges ahead. The walk back felt different. Rex still flinched at sudden noises. His steps were still hesitant. But he was trying. And that was enough for now. When they got home, Jack didn't push him. He just let Rex settle in, near the fireplace where it was warm. The next morning, Jack made breakfast. He placed a plate of eggs and bacon on the table. Then next to it, a smaller plate with a single strip of bacon. Rex eyed it. Jack watched, trying not to let his heart hammer against his ribs. And then, Rex ate. For the first time since the incident, he took food from Jack's hand without hesitation. It was a small thing, but for Jack it was everything. One last test, a memory rekindled. Later that day, Jack stood in the yard gripping something in his hands, the old battered tennis ball. Rex sat nearby, watching him. Jack took a slow breath and threw it. For a moment, Rex didn't move. Jack held his breath, and then a twitch, a shift. Rex's ears perked, and in the next heartbeat, he ran. Dirt kicked up beneath his paws as he charged after the ball, his body moving on instinct. Jack felt a lump in his throat, blinked hard as Rex snatched the ball in his jaws, his tail wagging for the first time in weeks. Jack knelt as Rex trotted back, the ball held firmly in his mouth. "Good boy," Jack whispered, his voice thick. Rex dropped the ball, right into Jack's hands, and just like that, Jack knew Rex was coming back to him, piece by piece. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, Jack let himself believe. Maybe, just maybe, they could heal. The morning light stretched across the sky, bleeding warm gold and soft pink into the clouds. Jack stood by the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, his eyes fixed on the yard. Rex was out there, not in his usual curled-up spot by the door. Not pacing the fence line like he had the past few days, but standing still, his ears perked, his nose lifted slightly, catching scents in the breeze. Jack exhaled, something tight loosening in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was different, and, after weeks of silence, hesitation, and distance, different was progress. Jack took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth before setting the mug down on the wooden railing. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He whistled. The sound was sharp, clear, cutting through the crisp morning air. Rex flinched. Jack held his breath. And then Rex turned. For the first time since that awful night, he turned without fear. Jack's chest ached as he watched Rex take slow, deliberate steps toward him. The distance between them had never felt so vast. But as Rex moved, something changed. His posture, his pace. The hesitation was still there, but so was something else. Something fragile, something hopeful. Jack lowered himself to the ground, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. "It's okay. It's just me." Rex stopped a few feet away. His tail was low but not tucked. His ears flicked forward. Jack saw the war happening in his eyes, the part of him that wanted to trust again, and the part that was still afraid. Jack's throat tightened. He needed to show Rex, not tell him. Show him. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the old bandana, the same one he used to tie around Rex's collar when they were still in the field. It was tattered now, faded from years of wear, but the scent of sweat, earth, and home still clung to it. Jack set it on, the ground between them, and then he waited, a moment of trust. The wind picked up, lifting the bandana slightly before it settled again. Rex's gaze locked onto it. Jack didn't move, didn't speak, just let the weight of time settle between them. The world had taken its time, breaking them apart. So now Jack would take his time, bringing them back together, seconds stretched into eternity. Then Rex moved, one cautious step, then another. Jack's breath caught as Rex lowered his head, sniffing the fabric. For a long moment, he didn't react. And then, his tail twitched. Small flicker of movement, a ghost of something that once was. Jack clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Rex took the final step forward and picked up the bandana. He didn't just hold it, he carried it. Like he had in the old days, like it meant something. Jack let out a shaky breath. "That's my boy," he whispered, and for the first time since that awful night, Rex looked up at him, really looked, and Jack knew. He remembered, breaking the final barrier. The moment passed as quickly as it came. Rex's ears flicked, and he hesitated. Again, as if unsure whether to trust what he was feeling. Jack swallowed hard. It was time. He reached into his pocket once more, fingers brushing against cold metal. When he pulled it out, Rex froze. The dog tag. His dog tag. Jack turned it over in his palm, his voice thick as he spoke. "You carried this for years, buddy." His throat worked against the lump rising there. Kept it safe, even when everything else was falling apart. Rex's nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply, his gaze fixed on the small piece of metal. Jack reached forward, slowly, carefully, and placed it in front of Rex. Silence, a heartbeat. And then Rex took it, not with hesitation, not with fear, but with certainty. Jack shut his eyes against the wave of emotion crashing over him. When he opened them again, Rex was already moving. He walked, past the bandana, past the dog tag and straight into Jack's arms. It wasn't hesitant, it wasn't forced, it was homecoming. Jack held onto him, pressing his forehead against Rex's, feeling the warmth of him, the weight of him. The scars were still there, but so was everything else, everything that mattered, and for the first time in a long, long time, Jack let himself cry, because he had his partner back, his best friend, his brother. The final test, a command from the past. That evening, Jack stood at the edge of the yard, watching the sky bleed orange and purple into the horizon. Rex sat beside him, his body relaxed, his tail resting against the dirt. Jack turned to him. "You ready?" he asked, a small smile tugging. At his lips, Rex's ears flicked. Jack lifted his hand in a familiar motion. The old command, the one that once meant everything to them. "Rex, heel." For a heartbeat there was nothing. Then Rex moved, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because he chose to, right beside Jack, where he belonged. Jack felt something break inside him, something that had been holding on for far too long. He let out a shaky breath and smiled. "That's my boy." Rex let out a small huff, his tail wagging just once, and just like that, Jack knew. They were whole again. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled deep in the bones. The stars stretched endlessly above, scattered like tiny beacons, in the dark. Jack sat on the porch steps, arms resting on his knees, watching as Rex lay beside him, his fur rising and falling with each steady breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. No hesitation. No fear, just trust. Jack reached out, running a hand through Rex's thick fur. "Feels like we've been through hell and back, huh?" he murmured. Rex let out a soft huff in response, his tail flicking lazily against the wooden boards. Jack chuckled, shaking his head. It was funny how life worked, how you could lose something, someone so completely, and then somehow, against all odds, find them again. The first real test. The next morning, Jack decided to take a risk. A real test. Not just in the safety of their backyard, where the world was predictable, but out in the open, where noise, people, and unpredictability still lurked like ghosts in the shadows. Jack loaded Rex into his truck, feeling the faintest hint of nerves creep up his spine. Would Rex be okay? Would he retreat? Shut down. Jack glanced over. Rex sat in the passenger seat, ears alert but calm. His amber eyes locked onto Jack's, steady and sure. Jack exhaled. They were ready. A familiar place. But everything had changed. The drive was short, leading them into town, where the streets hummed with morning activity. Pedestrians, honking cars, the scent of fresh bread drifting from a bakery. Jack pulled into the parking lot of a small coffee shop, the same one where he and Rex used to stop before everything changed. He turned to Rex. "You remember this place? Rex's—" The ears perked. Jack smiled. "Let's see if we can make some new memories." He stepped out, then opened the door for Rex, watching carefully. For a moment, Rex hesitated, just for a second. Then he hopped down, and instead of shrinking back, he stepped forward, right beside Jack. A world that finally feels right. Again they walked toward the outdoor seating area, where the scent of roasted coffee beans filled the air. A few people turned, their gazes flickering over Rex. Jack tensed. Would they see him as damaged? Would they whisper about the scars, the way his ears twitched at sudden noises? But then, "Hey, that's a gorgeous dog." Jack blinked, turning. Toward the voice, a woman smiled at him from one of the tables, her eyes warm as she watched Rex. Jack hesitated, then nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, running a hand over Rex's head. "He really is." The woman extended her hand slightly, pausing before moving any closer. "Can I?" Jack didn't answer. He let Rex decide. For a few seconds, Rex simply looked at her. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, sniffing her outstretched fingers. The woman grinned as she gently scratched behind his ears. Jack felt something in his chest loosen. They were okay. More than that, they were moving forward. A full-circle moment as the sun climbed higher. Jack and Rex sat together outside the cafe, Jack sipping his coffee, Rex lying at his feet, his tail thumping lightly against the ground. Jack reached into his pocket, fingers curling around the familiar metal of Rex's old dog tag. He turned it over, reading the engraving for what had to be the 1,000th time. Loyal till the end. His throat tightened. He set it on the table in front of him, letting the sunlight catch against its worn surface. Rex lifted his head, eyes flicking to the tag. Jack smiled. "We never really lost each other, did we?" Rex let out a small whine and nudged Jack's hand with his nose. Jack let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "No," he murmured. "Guess not. One last call, the past meets the future." That evening, Jack sat on the porch, his phone in hand. His thumb hovered over a familiar name. Sergeant Calloway, his old commanding officer, the man who had once told him to let go. Jack took a deep breath and pressed call. The line rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered. "Jack?" Jack swallowed, glancing at Rex, who lay beside him. "Yeah, Sarge, it's me." A pause. "You okay?" Jack let his gaze drift to the horizon, where the last sliver of sunlight painted the sky in shades of fire and gold. He smiled. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I think we are." And as Rex lifted his head, amber eyes locked onto Jack's. He knew. The past would always be a part of them. But the future, they'd face it together. Stronger. Unbreakable. And this time, neither of them was walking away.